We're an advisory body set up by the president, and we've got this broad cross-section of commissioners drawn from government, civil society, labor, various NGOs, and we have a young person who's a commissioner. I know that you're going to say it's not enough. We need a team of young people, and I can only agree with you. But I want to just acknowledge Ayaka Melitafa, who is our commissioner. So she's one of my bosses, and it's great to have you here. And she's been tirelessly championing youth issues at the level of the commission. So thank you for that work. Klengi was already thanked the organizations that helped work with us to help organize this. So again, just to say, the WWF Youth Climate Champions team, the Youth at SIRE team, the Institute for Economic Justice, and the SA Climate Action Network. Thank you, one and all of you. You've been great. It's lovely working with such a professional and highly committed team of people. And then to merely just introduce Danny, who is no stranger to many of you. I mean, you will probably remember him from his role in the Reserve Bank in South Africa. He was the deputy governor for many years. And more recently, we were very privileged that he took on the job of heading this presidential climate finance task team. And their job is to negotiate and pull together this $8.5 billion climate finance deal that was announced at COP26 last year. And he's got the incredibly difficult job of pulling these disparate international donors together, all with their differing offers and conditionalities and issues that they bring to the table, and then getting the South African government side lined up. And as you know, you put two ministers in the room and listen to them, and you think that you've got two completely different organizations, the way they talk. So there are many competing agendas, even inside government. So he's got to pull these two very different teams together and make sure that the process he's following is deeply consultative and that all the social partners are engaged. So Daniel asked us to help set up these engagements with the different social partners. This is the first engagement that is taking place. So it's with youth, it's with young people. Mr. Manele has indicated to us that it's not a one-off event. So he's seeing this as the start of a process, not the engagement. And he's indicated that he wants to be primarily in listening mode. So he's come here to hear your concerns and your issues. And I just want to encourage you to, so don't be intimidated by any of the people here. We actually all very nice people. Even though, some of us, like myself, look like old fossils, but we're still young at heart. And I want to encourage you to, use the opportunity, speak your mind. Don't be shy about what you say. All we ask is that you be respectful in the way that you raise points. I think you will find that you've got a really attentive audience. So thank you, and handing back to the chairs, and I think to then Mr. Manele.
Tanya? Can I hand back to you to jump in?
Thank you so much. First of all, to you and the PCC for the collaboration and helping us pull this session together. And of course, thank you for all of you for making the time to attend, including those that are joining us online. It is a source of encouragement when we see that much interest in the work that we do. So thank you very much. I am joined by members of our team, which I might just want to introduce very quickly. Chantal, you've heard already, who has introduced herself, and at the back there, I've got Janice Johnson and Sue Lunt, who's from our secretariat that is helping us with this process. Thank you very much for thank you for allowing at least an exception for this two over 35 to say a few words. It won't be that many. We will certainly give preference to you guys and hear and interact with you. And just to reiterate what's just been said, we certainly are not in box ticking mode and thinking that we need to demonstrate and be able to say somewhere that we've met with the youth. This is a genuine engagement, and so we're looking forward to that. I understand that you've had a preparatory meeting, again thanks to the PCC last week, which covered quite a number of issues in depth, quite some depth from what I saw, including, of course, information around the actual problem statement. What is it that we're really up against? What is South Africa up against in terms of the climate challenge? What will the cost be? Also the cost of inaction, of not doing anything. You talked about the just transition and the framework that the PCC put together. And I saw towards the end also touched on climate finance issues. So what's today about then? As has been said, this forms part of a series of consultations we are having with key stakeholder groups to help us in drafting the investment plan as part of this difficult task that Crispin has talked about that we've been assigned. And of course, consultation essentially is about engaging to hear views, to get opinions, to get advice, and just to confirm what's been said, to listen more to them speak. And so in that vein, my comments that I'm making now will really just be meant to open up the conversation, to set the scene for hopefully what will be an interactive discussion this afternoon. Let me just say very briefly what this task team is about and a little bit about its work. So, as Crispin has said, we are tasked with coordinating the relevant government departments, development finance institutions, the private sector, in overseeing the development of the relevant financing mechanisms and facilities that will enable international climate finance to flow in support of the Just Energy Transition Partnership to obviously augment our own efforts here. So the partnership with these 5 countries that have agreed to support South Africa through the mobilization of this initial amount of 8.5 billion with regard to the 3 identified priority areas that we talked about last time. So really in the process, what we need to ensure is that the financing instruments and the facilities that we negotiate are in alignment with our economic, with our socio-economic priorities, with our development imperative as a country, that they speak to the regulatory frameworks that we have in terms of our financial and fiscal challenges, and make sure that whatever we enter into, it takes into account what we can afford, and that what we put in is also sustainable. So my job is essentially to guide the work and submit to cabinet through an interministerial committee, which oversees the work that we do, recommendations on an investment plan and how it's going to be financed, and the package that will underpin that financing. And that whole package needs to demonstrate that we can meet our international commitments that, as you know, we've entered into, and in the process, of course, contribute to addressing our energy challenges, to contribute to growth and job creation, and while ensuring that those that are most affected by the transition to a greener future are sufficiently protected and supported in the process, and that the risks, the opportunities, the challenges, and the responsibilities, quite frankly, that come with the process that we need to engage with are allocated in a way that is fair, in a way that is equitable, and also to make sure that this 8.5 billion that we're looking at, which is relative to what is needed to transition us towards a net zero emissions target for 2050, happens within the broader context of what needs to be done, and not in isolation, and only through a narrow climate finance and lens only. And Crispin was alluded to the complexity of the multiple and urgent and challenging issues that are at play here, and which, of course, will overall affect our future, our growth and development strategy. And maybe as I close, just a few obvious points why it would be important for the task team to talk to you, to talk to the youth, because as young people, you're going to be the prime victims of climate change, and in terms of the damage that is currently being inflicted on the planet. And so, as a result of that, you will have to be at the forefront of contributing to the solutions and to responding to climate change. You should unashamedly hold decision makers accountable as they decide in your lives, they decide in your future. And of course, that, again, borrowing from what Crispin was saying, in many ways, is second prize. First prize, of course, are part of that decision making, and in the numbers that would be required, and ensuring that your voices are not only listened to, but are being heard, and you have to be part of co-creating these solutions that we have to develop. Youth unemployment is a big issue in this country, as you know, one of the biggest challenges. So you need to let us know how best we empower you, to help you take the lead, and how we get to meet these solutions. And any responses that we come up with, which don't incorporate and don't take into account appropriately young people's voices, will be found to be lacking in the end. So, yeah, we need to make sure that you are not on the receiving end of this global change agenda, but you are part and parcel and central to shaping it. And so, with those few words, I'll leave it at that. Probably spoke a little bit more than the allowance for the
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I think you have touched a bit on some of the things that a lot of us have been worried about, which is are you thinking about the job creation of the most vulnerable? Is this going to protect the most vulnerable in any way, or is it mostly going to be catered towards businesses? So we're happy to hear that, and also to hear that we're hoping to the money to contribute towards economic growth and address our energy challenges in South Africa. So thank you for that. And just to reiterate on the chat is that please introduce yourselves online, but also when you have something to say, please introduce yourself and your organization when we have a question. I'll hand over to Chantal.
Perhaps we can just check if there's some, initial questions based on Daniel's intervention. I'm just looking around the room if there are any at this stage. It looks like there's pending questions, but it hasn't reached to the point of delivery yet.
There's a hand here. Other side of the camera.
Oh, okay, sure. Go ahead. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Daniel. Can I call you Daniel?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. My name is Cindy, and I'm from the Wildlife and Environment Society of South Africa. I head up all of our schools and youth programs across the country. Thank you for the brief introduction, and I just would like to know if there is any specific limitations or restrictions or specific allocations for this climate fund and what those are. And if there's any specific kind of like partnership outlines between the 5 countries to South Africa. Is there anything that we can and cannot do? If you can just give us a brief outline of what that plan actually looks like.
Yeah, should we take a couple? And then
Oh, hi, my name is Sophia. I'm from the African
Hi, I'm from the African Climate Reality Project. And yeah, I just want to say thank you again for everyone who organized this. I appreciate, the point being taken that this is not a tick box exercise. But I think maybe if we could get into a bit more detail as to how the viewpoints of the youth are going to be taken seriously. And perhaps if we have some kind of mechanism for holding the task team accountable, if we do find that the eventual plan is lacking in youth voices. So just that accountability and transparency question. Thanks.
Anyone online want to have a question? I see a hand here out in the room.
there's another hand that's
Go ahead, thanks. Good day, everybody. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone else. My name is Stefazwa, and I'm from WWF. I'm part of the YCC steering committee. I like that Daniel mentioned that the youth are the most vulnerable. They're the most that are going to be mostly affected by this transition. And please allow me to ask, how many youths do we have in the task team that are heading the task team so far?
how many?
How many youths do we have?
Thank you for that question. Towards the end, I was also planning to ask how many young people are in the team, but yes, thank you for asking that. Online, there was someone who shared a question on the Q&A. Do you want to come in and share your question? Gwena, do you want to come in and share your question, or should I just read it out loud for you? Okay. All right, so his question is, how is the just transition framework going to ensure that the carbon tax is fully implemented and free from corruption with regards to the transparency in reporting the emissions with the Department of Environmental Affairs and tax compliance with SARS?
So just repeat that a little bit slowly.
How is the just transition framework going to ensure that the carbon tax is fully implemented and free from corruption with regards to transparency in reporting the emissions with the Department of Environmental Affairs and the tax compliance with SARS?
Okay, should we start with those maybe? About the other question. Thanks very much. Starting with the points that Cindy asked around limitations, restrictions, and so forth. What is the sort of overarching guiding document, if you wish, for this partnership, which was a precursor and then in a way gave rise to the partnership, is the nationally determined contribution that South Africa submitted, and you will be aware that at the COP26 conference last year, a revised, a more ambitious NDC document was submitted, which the PCC again played a very central role in building a national consensus around getting that document. So the framework that governs the partnership, the broad framework, is what was called a political declaration as part of announcing this partnership. And that political declaration, if you wish, kind of sets the guardrails, the boundaries, the sort of driving factors of what this partnership is going to be about. Obviously, honoring South Africa's leadership in having put up this very ambitious NDC, to say, on that basis, we, as these 5 countries, are happy to support you in implementing that, and will mobilize these funds. The political declaration also talks about what conditions South Africa finds itself in, what needs to be taken into account as they bring that support, some of the characteristics of how the financing needs to be in terms of it needing to be more advantageous, highly concessional, and reflective of the obligations that these countries have in terms of their international commitment to support developing countries in the transition. A critical component of it is around, which obviously is embedded in the NDC, is around reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and a transition in the economy overall to a low carbon economy, which requires us to decarbonize in the various ways that are contemplated to move away from being a highly dependent country on fossil fuels, in particular coal, to migrate more towards renewables as sustainable sort of energies. Where I think the other important thing to mention is that these countries, in entering into this partnership with South Africa, have said that this 8.5 must be viewed as an initial amount to support an initial period of 3 to 5 years. The transition overall, of course, is a much longer journey, a multi-decade project. So invariably, if you then say we're looking at a 3 to 5 year period, you then need to prioritize. You need to sort of enter into certain trade-offs, and those were chosen on the basis of where the most impact could be achieved in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time, with regard to the other objectives that I was talking about earlier, looking at what in the process also can be most catalytic in helping us with growth. So it's not surprising then that our electricity challenges and sort of energy security, given the cross-cutting nature and how many other areas are influenced by getting that right, would have featured. Then another area that was picked up as one of the priorities was around new energy vehicles. And that also, again, has to do with protecting livelihoods, with securing jobs, in that South Africa has been over many decades a part of the International Division of Labor in the motor vehicle manufacturing. And with us having a number of the key global players having hubs here in South Africa from which we export to the UK, to continental Europe, Australia, the US, we export to various parts of the world. But one, of course, we're exporting these internal combustion engines, and some of our trading partners, in particular in Europe, have already introduced much tighter emission standards and have plans from 2030, 2035, which is the biggest scheme of things around the corner, migrating to electric vehicles. So the production of the vehicles that we are involved in at the moment is not sustainable. We won't be able to sell them to anybody in the long run. So there are 100,000 people around that are dependent on that just direct, before you take into account indirect jobs. As I said, it's an important earner of export revenue. So you can see where that becomes an important sort of sector to look at. The other one, which holds great promise, is green hydrogen, which has been identified as a fuel of the future with multiple applications that can be sitting in private vehicles, in transport, public transport, right up to aviation fuels. Early days, but holding great promise. Some of the studies and the proof of concepts that have been undertaken, with lots of research still need to happen, seems to suggest that there could be great potential in this and South Africa, given our technology and a comparative sort of advantage that we have with some of the technologies, such as the one that Sasol uses, that can be sort of translated to other issues. Again, there, both for domestic and for export use, green hydrogen was got that potential. So those are the kind of issues, but that needs to be understood from a point of view, saying it's initial period. You had to choose and say, where do we get the greatest impact? But obviously, it's not restricted. The change is meant to obviously make the entire economy as we transition over many years. The second question was around young people and the task team. We haven't made as much progress as we would have wanted to. There, we had identified some people to join the task team, but there are some governance processes that we needed to still go through that delayed that, but it's certainly on the radar screen, as I said earlier on, that you young voices need to be heard and you be part of decision making. So hopefully next time I come here, I can bring them along as members of the task team. But certainly, even while that is not, we also wouldn't just rely on a member of the task team to transmit these messages. Our interactions with you and listening to you, all of that, make sure that you are part and parcel of the process. Then there was an issue around accountability and carbon tax and those kind of issues. So the just transition framework, as I alluded to earlier, was completed, and I was fortunate to join the PCC colleagues when they presented the framework to the president, and it's on its way to cabinet and to be formally adopted. But the process that I talked about earlier, in terms of how it was developed, the highly sort of participatory and consultative nature of it, and the fact that we've got, if you wish, cross memberships between the commission and the cabinet, I think doesn't have too many risks about how that framework will then find its way as a formal sort of cabinet in both, but that is yet to happen. There was a comment about the carbon tax. I think again South Africa showed leadership in identifying that and introducing the carbon tax as one of the key responses that can help with reducing carbon emissions. It is a complex system, and it was introduced with very clear understanding that the economy needs time to transition in terms of where this price is set and how it gets over time to incentivize people to shift. It gets increased. The first phase of it had to be extended. It was meant to end in this year and next year, but with a strong commitment that in the subsequent phases, what we have not been able to achieve now will be clawed back. So there'll be an accelerated pace of that, and the work around registration processes, trading system and exchange of this credit is progressing, and it's certainly an important contribution, which of course, as was correctly said, we need to make sure that its administration through the Treasury, through SARS, is effective, and to see that some of the proceeds that come from there can then be also appropriately recycled to support the overall transition process. I hope I haven't got anything.
Maybe one way you can be a bit more specific, which was specifically how will the contributions from this consultation actually be taken on board? I think that was the last question.
So again, as we said, this is a opening of the dialogue, and which will continue, and there'll be multiple interactions. The next time we come to see you, we'll be talking to you about, in a bit more detail, about our investment plan and what is in it. And I think there you would be probably in a position to be the judge yourself already, to say that we've been heard. Are there any elements in here that talk to some of the issues around the just transition, around youth, around women empowerment? And it's meant to be an iterative process, and we have basically from the start of the establishment of the task team committed ourselves to a process that is open, that is transparent. The PCC has kindly agreed to give us a standing slot on its agenda of its quarterly meetings, at which we will come back as the task team and give a report in terms of the work that we've been doing. Use that again as a forum to get feedback, to collect further inputs to kind of work that we are doing. And we participate in these meetings, we go to webinars, we make public speeches when we get invited to explain what we are about. And quite frankly, you wish to be held accountable in terms of that.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Khatiso Amahlemiataza. I am from the Conscious Campaign and Youth at SIA. So I have two questions. The first question is, what criteria are you using to employ or look for the youth representative within your task team? I'm just asking that question because we need youth who are very understanding of intersectionality and the need to be, the need for intersectionality within the climate justice movement. And then my second question is, how do we know that the things that you're not saying are the things that you're saying are not a form of complacency? Because you keep saying that, oh, we are in the process of what's going to take some time, or and this is always happening. I mean, even when you're I love African studies, and if you're studying the speeches of African leaders, it's always oh, in 10 years time, oh, it's multi-generational, oh, it's going to take decades. How am I how do we measure progress if it's always we are in the process of I'm in the process of drinking water now, and I'm not even drinking water. How do you, I don't know if this makes sense, but yeah.
Thank you. Can I take?
Yes, sure.
Yes. There are two questions online. If they would like to come in at the table, call you had your hand raised. before, and Sisto as well. Yes, and while they come in online, my question is, is there a timeline for the when the investment plan needs to be put together and presented? So also, like, is there a timeline as to when is the second session with the youth going to be? Please come in online.
Thank you. Hi to everyone present in person session. So my question has already been asked around basically, you know, what is the plan to engage all the stakeholders that are being consulted moving forward? You know, speaking specifically.
This, yes.
May I suggest that you maybe type the question into the chat? You're very faint in terms of being able to hear you.
Okay, we'll do.
Is it not?
Or is it a wrong-
Put the speaker there. Where's the microphone?
It wasn't working. It was too
Wasn't.
faint.
Since it's there.
Okay.
Mute the speaker
Okay,
and it'll work.
ask them to speak. Please come in again.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you on here. It's just not going through our sound system.
I'll just type it on the chat. Is that fine?
Yes.
Yes, that is fine. Sorry, we'll work on the sound side. Please share your questions on the Q&A and I'll read them out loud. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, we'll sort it out with the sound.
Okay, maybe I will take the questions in the room for now. The lady at the back, and then she can please go.
Thank you. Okay, I have a few questions, but just maybe, I think most of us were in the initial engagement. And before I ask the questions, just to highlight that there were quite a few questions around the type of finance that it would be. So if you could just get clarity, or if you could direct us to resources that would create clarity on how much will be grant, what will be loan, what will be debt, and sort of details around that. There'd also been a question around whether this is new or existing finance, and if we have any answers around how much of the finance could possibly be converted from already committed finance. Then just Daniel, going off of what you had mentioned around, there were questions that the youth were asking around why are we focusing on these three areas of electric vehicles, green hydrogen, and supporting ESCOM. You mentioned then that this was sort of cross-cutting issues, that these issues represented a possibility to leverage for growth. I think that these three focus areas, it's kind of implicit that this focus on mitigation is coming from the fact that this is responding to the NDC. But could you maybe share some resources, some information around how these are going to be impactful areas for investment? I think that would be useful for youth. And then you also spoke to sort of the stranded asset theory with regards to the electric vehicles. I mean, in the face of deregulation now that we are seeing with sort of the energy that we're trying to bring on board now in our energy crisis, how can we be assured as young people that these regulations will not just sort of stamp out any possibility for local employment, local ownership, et cetera, et cetera? How do we have trust in this process? And specifically, maybe you can talk to what are some of the commensurate measures then
that will stimulate local production in a way that does actually increase net decent work opportunities. So not just jobs, but we are looking at stimulating decent work and actually increasing work. So it's not just about replacing jobs, but actually increasing employment overall. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Desiree. I'm the head of the youth programs at Youth at SIA. So maybe speaking more from a practitioner's point of view, having been in the climate space since COP17, so almost 11, 12 years now. Just a quick one, how much, if any, of this budget will go to skills development, academic programs, TVET colleges, universities, organizations, any of those things? Because I think, you know, we talk about these things very upstream and they sound great in the highest level, but I think there often lacks this actual on the ground implementation that comes all the way down to basic education. And if we talk about a 3 to 5 year window, it'd be interesting to know how we got to that discussion on most impact on greenhouse gas emissions and who was in the room and how those all were taken up and, you know, who are these determiners? And so basically the question is, what, if anything, is going to go to youth initiatives, upskilling, all these other sort of things that would actually get some of these young people who are in the room to actually be in those positions of those jobs or other sort of things, or upskill our teachers or any of those sorts of pieces, which could also be done in a very impactful way in the next 3 to 5 years. Equally with that, maybe we also bring in gender and other sort of discussions, because when we see how a lot of these projects, especially on renewables, are actually implemented, and again, I'm just speaking from my own personal experience, having studied at places like Stellenbosch Sustainability Institute, I'm sitting in solar energy classrooms where there's 50 people, and of them there's 3 women and maybe 2 women of color, and you know, so the space is also very dominated still. And so when we actually talk about a just transition, what is that actually looking like? That's my question. Thanks.
Thank you, Desiree. Just checking if the sound is working. Can we switch to the online questions now?
Just checking.
Yeah, so apparently the key is all of our mics must be off, and then you'll hear them through the system.
So there's quite a few comments that were made. Maybe we make the next round from those that are online and just try and tackle these ones so we don't sort of lose focus. Can you see the first question was the criteria that we're going to use? I suppose age might be a good place to start, right?
Yeah.
So it'll be age, but it's certainly in terms of what I indicated earlier, the person we identified was obviously proven track record of previously engaged in these discussions. In the instance of that particular person, it was a young academic who obviously written on some of these issues and spent time engaging on them deeply, both practically and politically, and being connected to those. So that's the kind of stuff we're going to make sure that people are rooted in the issues and really have qualification to be able to speak and to present. But there are also going to be people from the testing point of view, that's how people are there, that then reach out and engage with constituencies. The issue of process is unfortunately one that is part and parcel of the story, and Crispin alluded to earlier on in terms of both the international partners as well as domestically needing to pull things together, needing to make sure that we have, as a country, a unified vision of how we want to transition. Quite frankly, to be able also, knowing that, in a better position to articulate what actually we want. What is clear is that this is a very complex process of what we need to put together. And also, as has been said many times, in many ways, this is new land. This hasn't been done before. This is a historic partnership, the way it is being conceived. Nobody has done before. So we are making our way as we go in that regard. And that's why this process of consulting and having regular stops, engaging with people and trying to find out how actually collectively would we define success? How do we know that we're on the right track, and how do we measure and how do we keep each other informed is that? But the process is unfortunately one that requires, for instance, the actual plan ultimately to be taken to various sort of government bodies, because it's got to be a cabinet approved investment plan. And there was also a question on the timeline for it. Our plan, we are working on it as we speak, is to be able, that's what we're aiming for, to launch this plan at COP 27, which is in a few months' time in Egypt, which, yeah, I sympathize with things taking long and processes, and we're in the process of, we are busy doing this and doing that and not seeing results as such. But if we get to a point of launching that in Egypt in November, this would have been quite a bit of progress made within a year. And certainly some of the processes around this, I think, are showing a slightly different approach. And again, if I can just commend our colleagues here, if you just look at what the PCC in the relatively short time of its existence has been able to achieve, which obviously is a lot more than just talking as such. And the other issue, which I guess make this process slightly different, is that this is not music of the future. This is not a future problem that we're dealing with. The regularity of climate change, a disaster, the floods that we've seen, and various issues that makes that our lived reality today also imparts an element of urgency, because the underlying problem is not one that might sort of manifest somewhere out there. We're living with climate change, with consequences of climate change already, and in fact, not just because of what we've been seeing recently. We go into farming communities, people have been seeing climate change for the last 10 years. I mean, obviously, this has been pushed a little bit higher up the agenda, and we've heard some of these discussions have been on the go for quite a while, and with some of these commitments being put on the table and not being delivered on. But I think the pressure has been increasing, and hopefully that will translate in more action as we go along. But understanding of some element of frustration of saying, look, what makes this different? Is this not more talk of what we've been used to? I can understand, but certainly we are alive to that, and hopefully this process will show a slightly different approach. The types, the question was asked. It is a combination of concession, the refinance, which obviously, again, the complexity of just defining what that means. And we have set a benchmark of saying that one of the guiding principles must be that it's got to be at rates that are more advantageous than what South Africa is able to put off its own debt in the capital markets, given that it's got the mechanisms, it's got the name, it's got the track record, but we need to see something that is much more ambitious than that, which speaks to these international commitments and how one needs to look at differently at development finance when compared to climate finance. But these are questions that are being debated right across the globe, including, for instance, how do you define net zero? And where is that pegged from? There are big debates that are happening, but we are in the process. We have seen offers from the partners which we are negotiating with them on, which we are interrogating. They have indicated certain splits in terms of instruments of how they think that could work. But the reason we haven't gone public about that is that we are still in discussions with them. But my commitment area of transparency and inclusiveness will result in eventually all this becoming known. That will be known in terms of how exactly the sources of the funds, what that will represent, and the uses of those funds will be shown. But as I say, concession loans, there's grants, there are guarantees, and other innovative risk sharing and risk participation instruments that one would have to consider. I think the question that was asked around the three areas I had sort of tried to touch on earlier. Again, this is the initial phase of the transition, and there had to be discussions and the compromise, which these things always are, that was landed on was to say, where do we get relative to our NDC commitments, maximum traction early on, and that's how the electricity sector got an element of priority, but the overall plan and the overall transition, as the Just Transition Framework also touches upon, is really to crowd in investment right across the economy and create jobs. The issues around electric vehicles, regulations, and to what extent this will not just serve to support current players. One of the key principles that is in the political declaration, and which is certainly guiding the negotiations, is that this plan, this partnership must be South African owned, it must be South African led, and it must be South African specific. It must speak to our priorities, to our ambition. We own the plan, we produce it, and our partners, of course, have to concur with it. But their role is for us to discuss with them how best they can support us. And those issues around regulatory issues that need to be taken into account will need to be guided by this overarching issue of saying that it needs to speak to what South Africa needs and what our priorities are, and that needs to be taken care of in that process. Issues of decent jobs and job opportunities, the political declaration also very much speaks to not only preserving the jobs that are there, but this whole economy transition and the transformation of the economy being one that is that the transition must be part and parcel of informing a new growth and development model that that creates jobs on a net basis. But there are challenges there. For instance, if you look at the skill space, we need to get involved in reskilling and retraining and skills development. There are also other realities, for instance, that the production of these electric vehicles, if you stay with that theme, requires fewer components that the internal combustion engines do. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into it. But at the end of the day, this is going to be growth enhancing. It's going to crowd in investment. It's going to allow for the economy to work for people. And in terms of the plan, and there's not a question around the components and the skills, how much has been allocated to that. Again, very, very tricky and difficult work, but that we're not shying away from. We hope that in the plan we'll have different categories of areas that need to be addressed, and with estimates of actually what the funding and the costing of those elements would need to be. That is very clear what needs to go there. What is, of course, already clear now is that we are probably underestimating the component of how much is needed to support the just transition. So that is probably going to be more, and we will need to obviously work on how that then get financed again, looking at the longer term trajectory of where the funding is going to come from, and with the issues of making sure that we don't end up piling on more climate related debt in the process. A lot of trade-offs, prioritization, sequencing as we go through, but our ambition is to show in the plan exactly the different components of the just and what skills, what to do, reindustrialization, and those kind of components is what we are developing. And as I said, we will be able to share more of that when we come back to you. The other questions for when exactly we're going to come back to you. It will be between now and sort of the middle of September around about. So it's kind of relatively soon. It's not something that's going to be sort of put off forever, that you're not going to see us again. So we will be here back here fairly soon. The questions of who was in the room, how did the priorities get determined, and where we the decision makers was. Look, I mean, I could chicken out and say it was before me, but that would be that would be the easy way out. My understanding is that there were multidisciplinary teams from different branches and arms of government, which consulted on the actual transaction, the political declaration, which was then negotiated at Glasgow. And in fact, in terms of who we've got in the task team, it's a mixture of those people that have got that history of where we got there, and also people that are now more suitable in terms of how we move forward. But many of the issues in the political declaration, we have to say, have not been specified in the detail. So, and this is part of this process of saying, how do we put pressure on the point? How do we want to define what's the just transition? And so that's the work that's ongoing in terms of giving effect to that. There are high level commitments with the view of saying we are sending people now out there to go and flesh it out and come back and report. And some of you may have seen that we issued a 6-month leaders report. We started talking to how some of the principles would inform that, some of the policy and measures that South Africa is putting in place as enabling mechanisms to make sure this partnership succeeds. Some of the principles that we've identified would be important in negotiating the finance as such. But the long and short of it is that a lot of the detail is what this process entails. They need to be worked out.
Maybe just as a quick summary, because there's a lot that's been said, right? So there was a certain chronology of how things have evolved. So prior to COP26, there was actually at least a 2 or 3 year process of different bodies of work happening in the country. A lot of it was standing behind Eskom around how does Eskom transition, what are the challenges, a lot of Eskom's debt concerns, and there was lots of different pockets of work that was happening over that 2 or 3 year process. I think what then happened was that there was almost a consolidation of that work and a recognition, particularly and partly driven by the UK government's saying it's a coal COP, them recognizing that the justice issues needs to be at the forefront, and a perfect storm of South Africa in a way, in that we were in this really difficult situation where we had Eskom needing to do something, needing to decarbonize, needing additional climate finance support to get there. So there were a number of factors that came together in a smaller negotiation team, which I believe involved Eskom, and it involved the department, and it involved parts of government, and the technical people that had been doing the work over those prior 2 years. leading up to what was then a political declaration announced in early November last year at the COP. And then there was work that was done around, and then the 5 countries organized themselves. So it's the EU, France, Germany, United Kingdom, and the US organized themselves in something called the International Partner Group. So they called the IPG. And those partner countries came together, and decided what each one of them individually could offer South Africa. So when Daniel speaks about the financing offers, it is those individual offers that are being discussed, which is a combination of all sorts of instruments, including the ones that was mentioned just now, grants and loans and others. And that configuration is still part of that conversation. And what started happening in South Africa domestically then was the consolidation of work here under the task team. And the task team's biggest deliverable for this year is the development of this investment plan and being able to look at those offers and actually give cabinet advice on whether these offers are suitable to the country's needs. In some ways, the investment plan is overarching, independent of whether we get funding or not, because we will transition and we need to transition anyway. So it's got elements of a longer term agenda in it, but it's also got elements that are specific to the 5 partner countries, which are those 3 priority areas that were discussed at the end of last year. But it is not exclusive. But the mandate of the task team is really just around this. And then, of course, that's why the PCC is a good partner, in that there are elements that are much longer range issues that the PCC, has helped and through debate on the task team contributes to. So where we are now, just as a summary, as we halfway through the conversation, is a sense of we've got a first draft of the investment plan that we're working through, the secretariat, that Sue and her team are helping us work through that. It's got elements that are drafted, elements that aren't drafted. It's got elements of principles against which we want to execute the just energy transition. It's got elements of, for example, the social dimensions. How do you reflect youth? How do you reflect small and medium enterprises? But it doesn't have the precision, Desiree, that I think you might have been asking with the lady at the back in terms of how much is allocated to a particular thing. So we might get there, but it also depends on the offers that are coming through from the partner countries. So we will give a degree, it might just be a range or a magnitude, order of magnitude of what we are targeting. So, and then from today, which is the kickstart for the rest of this month and part of September, is this iterative process of different stages of consultation. Take those on board, and then fine tune the investment plan with the sense of taking that to cabinet early October, right, Daniel? Earlier. If we get there, that's the aim. If we get there, early October, and then South Africa approves the plan. It's not that we're going to get the partner countries to approve the plan. That's the other important point to make. It's theirs to take a look at and endorse, and if they don't like parts of it, well, then they must fund the parts that they like. But it doesn't change the need, right? Great. So just I thought I just mentioned that as a summary for now.
Just to add what Chantal has been saying, I mean, some of these issues I was a little bit more cautious about, because that is actually our next session around sort of going into more details about the actual makeup of the plan and the timelines. I think the key one is that by the time we get to the COP, we want to be able to launch that plan. Lots of work that needs to be done internally. And so if we, and that is obviously the plan, to get to cabinet within a time frame that allows us to cross the line, if you wish, at the time of COP. And I think the point that to reiterate in terms of what Chantal has just said is really, again, whether there's an IPG or not, South Africa needs to transition. We need to have our investment plan. We need to have our investment frameworks taking us all the way to 2050. And so the key issue is us owning it and making sure that our own priorities and ambitions are reflected in it, so that they can support it. But there is obviously an element of it which is also realistic, is that we cannot transition with our own resources only. So hence an element of trade-offs and needing to be pragmatic to be able to release those funds, to be able to crowd in much bigger pools that are sitting in the private markets, for instance. But when we come back to you in September, we will talk to you a little bit more detail about the actual building blocks of the plan.
Thanks, Daniel and Chantal, for that. That was very helpful. So that we don't exclude anyone online, I would like to ask that the people online who have questions raised on the Q&A, please raise them. And while we're unmuting them, just to say that Daniel and his team have questions for young people that they hope we can respond to and will help them in terms of their investment plan. So if we don't have time to respond to those questions, what will happen is possibly that we'll respond to those questions through submissions and send them by email before the September consultation. Titeho, if you're ready, please come in.
Hi, sorry. So it's actually Tyler here, because of the way the link was sent. We all, a lot of us online have the Devoko's name. So it's Tyler Boothia, I'm part of the Youth Policy Committee. I hope you can hear me clearly. I guess I haven't been interrupted yet, so that's the case. So I just maybe wanted to reflect is that the statements that you have just shared and the explanation of the process leading up now has been very useful. And detailing that there is an existing draft, and I think many of the young people online and in room would probably reflect is that it would be useful for us just to look at that document when it's ready to be shared, so that we can reflect on it and sit with it a bit longer, and give our policy inputs, not just our stakeholder inputs as we're airing here, and making sure that they're actually reflected in writing. And so I think there was two things that I did want to bring up. And so I think the first one is we understand the need for Eskom to transition, and the essential of that sector being one of all.
Hello?
Is that skills, training, funding, education, that's not going to be considered, or SMEs, they're not considered. For us, that means that I hope you can still hear me. If that's not considered, it means it's not accessible. And if it's not accessible, it's not just. And so if it's not just, it's not a just transition plan, it's a green transition plan. So that's the first point. And then the second one is about the fact that a lot of this is residing in the fact that it's debts. And I think just our concern is, what is the timeline for paying back these debts? Because if we're thinking realistically, we're still going to be getting receipts. But at the same time, once us as young people start working, these debts are going to be affecting the economy we enter and the world we enter. So not only are we going to have a climate changing world, we're also going to have an economically potentially unstable. And knowing the rates of how corruption plagues our country, it's very difficult to want to create a situation of more debt without that added transparency, especially in an institution that has already failed in so many other aspects.
Tyler, we keep losing you.
No, I think that.
Are you done?
She's done because she's muted.
Oh, okay.
Should we read the online questions?
And no. Oh, Andile, do you want to come in and say your question? All right. We seem not to have the people that raise the questions on the Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay. I'm trying. What I'm going to ask is if my colleague can read out some of the questions up there and then we take the questions in the room. Yeah.
Okay, I'll start with Celine's. What are the immediate legal and compliance implications of the process of increasing carbon tax integrity? And the next question from Andile, is the climate finance already in our coffers? Is this finance meant for ESCOM as per the President's Energy Crisis Plan? That's a submission from Andile Mlambo, Grassroots for Climate Action. Anonymous submission. Mr. Daniel mentioned that we need to have a unified vision of how we want to transition as a country. How does the process of ensuring this look like? How will the marginalized actually be included, as they've oftentimes overlooked, particularly those from rural areas who don't have as much access to such knowledge and engagements? Thank you, Blessing, for this comprehensive answer. It will also be nice to have a capacity development framework in place to promote ownership of the just transition for the youth and communities, as we are aware that in many communities, especially the youth, are not aware of what the just transition is all about. And lastly, from Gwena Matlala, the just transition framework speaks to distributive justice, where the risk and opportunities resulting from the transition must be distributed fairly, cognizant of gender, race, and class inequalities. How is that going to be achieved?
Oh,
So just leave them on there.
in the meantime, in the room. Oh, okay, wait. Wait.
Just try and deal with it. But it's great. It's good that there's interactive. Excuse me. I mean, the first question, if I recall correctly, was breaking up a little bit. I mean, I think we're on the same page there, that we need to be very clear how we define success. How will we be able to say this transition is just? And of course, the ultimate judge on this will be the people that are most impacted. They will need to tell us whether they're seeing any difference, whether this is addressing their needs, hence the importance of these consultative processes that have been ongoing. And absolutely right. If there is no appropriate consideration of how SMMEs, how youth, how women are taken into account, if those are sort of glaring omissions, will make it difficult for an argument to say, look, this has got the just components appropriately reflected, and this is a part and parcel of the process. And this, I guess, speaks to how the process of ensuring this looks like. The process is something like what you're doing today, and the process is engaging with the different constituencies. The process is leveraging on work that was previously done in terms of research from various constituencies, labor, civil society, business formations, research foundation, philanthropies, think tanks. All of that has been taken into account to ensure that just as much as we are today talking about the voice of the youth, that of course all these other voices form part and parcel of how we get to a common understanding of what we want and how actually we keep each other honest, we hold each other accountable as we go along to see that we are getting the desired outcomes, and having the courage as we go along. We've got the right monitoring process in place to course correct as we go along, because some of these issues we also have to admit are subject to many moving pieces and unfolding situation in terms of how these climate risks are registering, that as we go along, we need to take into account how the situation evolves and adapt to it and change and make corrections that are necessary. Again, the question that was asked around debt, unfortunately, that is going to be part and parcel of it, that we can't wish away. But the key issue is that we have to be able to afford that debt. And like with any decent investment proposals, which is funded by debt, hopefully you employ it in such a manner that it returns more than just allowing you to repay the debt. So that the net basis, that was a worthy investment, and we're taking that debt on. If you just work on being able to repay it, and then on that basis you haven't achieved much. But the timelines are things that are part of the discussions that we're having now. Some of the discussions, of course, given the long-term nature of this project, will include a component such as long grace periods, that there is a sufficient amount of time for these projects to take root and start producing revenue that will allow us to support that debt. And all of this happens within our overall fiscal framework in terms of what I said earlier, of what is affordable and what is sustainable in the mix. But there has to be a component of this will have to be debt that unfortunately one can run away from. Then there was a question around the carbon tax and integrity of it all. And I suppose there, again, what the task team is not meant to do is to subsume the roles of other actors and other agencies that have got their mandate. It's obviously to facilitate, to coordinate the roles that agencies such as ours, that is the National Treasury, that is to make sure that whatever tax proposals and other policy pronouncements that have been made in the bigger scheme of how we run the country, that has got integrity, and that people are in that vein also accountable for what we do. That's part and parcel of how one would continue to run efficient government with the various processes that are underway and now around increasing efficiencies, removing red tape, and freeing up the energy sector, continuing structural reforms, and the various initiatives that are underway will have to continue, and responsibilities appropriately allocated to those that are best suited to manage them. Then there's a question whether the money is in our coffers. Did I understand that correctly? No, it's not. That is the job that we're busy with. As I said, we need to convert what is a commitment to support our transition into actual climate finance flows, into actual cash that can register other mechanisms that allows us to then invest in this transition. And the mechanisms that would have been announced, that were announced by the president, did make reference to an element of this JETP funding being part of the solution. But that is not a question of that money being diverted from elsewhere. That was what was in the plan anyway, that the JETP funding in terms of application would help us with repurposing and the decommissioning of power stations, with investment in strengthening the transmission and the grid system, and with obviously facilitating generation of new capacity, in particular renewables. So that was sort of part of the plan anyway, and it just got confirmed with reference to that in the president's announcement. Let me see if I've read all of them. The last one.
The last one relates to, Daniel mentioned that we have a unified vision of how we want to transition as a country. How does the process of ensuring this look like? The
Next one.
It was the just transition framework, distributive justice, where the risks and opportunities resulting from the transition must be distributed.
Would you like me to?
You can talk to that if there is, I mean, but maybe there's a purpose to that. Yeah, that's what obviously I was indicating earlier, that those are some of the principles that guide us around risk, opportunities, challenges, and responsibilities. The how is really the processes and the hard work that's been done.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, distributive justice is one of the core principles on which the just transition framework rests. And it requires a comprehensive response in terms of making sure people that are most vulnerable in this transition have the skills and resources and assets that they need to navigate it. And that needs measures implemented across a range of strategies, including, as we rehabilitate, watersheds and mining land, using the assets that are freed up in that rehabilitation process and actively redistributing them. So we need to think about asset allocation that gets freed up in the transition. We've got to think about what's the investment that we need to make in skills development and training and reskilling. We've got to think about the social support mechanism. So even some workers may fall through the cracks as we move out of some industries and move into the others. What's the kind of income support mechanisms that we're putting in place to make sure that there's safety nets for those? Not all of this can be solved with the 8.5 billion. So the 8.5 billion, as Daniel said, is an important catalytic intervention. And we're wanting it to unlock a whole range of other initiatives on the path to ensuring a just transition. But to get to a just transition is going to take the collective effort of everyone. Government at all its various levels and the private sector living up to their corporate responsibility, and the collective activism and energy that all of you bring to the table.
Well, I think that has been quite a while.
I've been waiting.
Thanks for that.
Afternoon, everybody. My name is Zadir Suleiman, and I am a national focal point for the Global Change Working Group of the Youth Policy Committee. I have two questions. I'm going to try to go through them as speedy as possible to give my colleagues a chance to ask some questions as well. But as a young person, reading the headlines coming out of COP26 that this 8.5 billion is going to be given to South Africa, I genuinely thought we're not seeing that money. That money is not coming to us. I'm pretty sure almost all of the youth here could share the same sentiment. So it might be a little obvious to ask if there are any security measures and anti-corruption measures around this money, but I would like to take the opportunity to ask if there are. And if there are, I would like to also take this opportunity to call for more transparency around the deal. We as young people, we might not understand the full economics behind it, but we're looking for a deal that is transparent and where information around the funds and the pathways and the financial bodies that are surrounding some of the offers that are being made. We're looking to see what those offers are and specific reasons why that money is being given to respective sectors. My second point regards the international partners. Considering that as stipulated by the Paris Agreement, $100 billion is supposed to be given every year. And I don't want to name those countries, but they are part of the international partners. They haven't been able to fulfill those things. We've barely been able to hit 70 billion per year when the target is 100 billion. A tangent to that is that a lot of those countries, including the European countries, are buying a lot of coal from South Africa. So it's kind of locking us into this high debt, high carbon pathway. So to what extent do we as South Africa, as much as you did touch on it, that we approve where the offers come from and we approve how they'll be used, to what extent do we hold them accountable, and what lines do we draw with what role they will play throughout the entire process? I'd just like to end off by saying thank you for the opportunity on behalf of all of the youth. We're actually really eager to hear that this is not just a one-sided conversation. You have questions for us, and we're hoping to deliver a statement to you after this that actually has a lot of our questions, comments, and concerns that have been developed by the Youth Policy Committee. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, my name is Natavi Singh, and I'm a member of the Youth Policy Committee at UTHSI. I'm also a national focal point for the Socioeconomic Development Work Area. I'd like to raise 3 points very quickly. One on localization, another on innovation, and another on development, specifically looking at South Africa's history and how we are going to move away from an extractive economy to one that is regenerative. So on localization, UTHSI mentioned in our YCAP, our South African Youth Climate Action Plan, that we want to promote and support the investment into sustainable local manufacturers, which further foster job creation and limit associated rise in carbon emissions. And another one on localization is, sorry. Okay, that's my only point on localization. On innovation, so I'm a computer science student, and I really love the fact that, you know, innovation can solve a lot of problems, you know, building stuff to solve the world's problems. And at UTHSI, we mentioned in our Young Leaders Conference, the declaration that we want to highlight the role of youth innovation in developing sustainable solutions to global challenges through technology. And we also want to suggest that, which is something from our SAYCAP, establishing national centers of excellence for the development of national experts in renewable and in the renewable energy sector, as well as supporting the reformulation of administrative and regulatory approval procedure to ensure that they are transparent, efficient, and allow for easy entry. As you've noticed in the room, a lot of points, the main theme was definitely the lack of trust between members of public and government bodies. We want to know where the money is going, so we want transparency, but we also want easy access. We want to be so involved in this. We speak about 2050, but respectfully, okay. We will be here in 2050.
And you'll see the
No, just no, on a serious note, we will be here in 2050, and we want to be involved because we want to see the results of our hard work. There is, when it comes to innovation, we need to foster talent, and we also need to protect that talent. There's so many great ideas on how we can move to a more greener economy and to like save the planet. However, it's very hard for young people to now either commercialize that and benefit, or for communities to benefit from that. So we really want easy access to that sort of development. So I think that is my point. Oh yes, South Africa, just the last point. South Africa has a history of an extractive economy, and we want to move away to one that is more regenerative. So that includes the circular economy, that includes looking after our ecosystems. And, you know, you mentioned green hydrogen, which is really good for transitioning. To South Africa, you know, we have platinum, and platinum is a catalyst in the process of removing hydrogen from water, like separating elements, which is really good. But South Africa, we don't really own a lot of that platinum, and I think Mr. Daniel, you mentioned how, you know, it must be made in South Africa, and we must have that ownership. We don't have that ownership, that complete ownership, and communities that live near these platinum reserves and mines don't really benefit from that. So how can we ensure that they benefit from that? Because, you know, we're all proud to be South African and proud to have these local products. So let's just keep that in mind as well. So innovation, development, and technology and localization. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is King Solomon Kabete, and I'm from Sekunda in Mpumalanga. Needless to say, I'm one of the young people who are going to be unfortunately affected by the transition. So that's why today I'm in this conversation, and hopefully we get to be with my peers part of the decision making. So I'm not going to make a point about green funding because I think you've alluded on that. But I do have two questions which speak to inclusivity, which was something that we kept on reiterating when we drafted the SA YCAP and also the Joburg YCAP. So my first question is, how is the PCC will be and willing to continually engage youth in the implementation part of things, and especially youth from communities like mine, mostly at risk, and how will this pan out and be done considering the disparities within the youth group? And the second question is, how much power or authority do we have as youth in directing or suggesting where the money should be channeled? Thank you.
There's another.
Thank you. I just have three very short questions. So I think, and Crispin kind of touched on this, but I think if we could get a bit more detail around the justice work, because I think, and it would have been great to know the breakdown of a loan versus a grant, because I think that will largely determine how much of this money is actually going to revenue generating projects versus social security. So I think, and maybe something to keep in mind for the next meeting. So for example, is there an opportunity for workers to have access to these kinds of funds, or will it purely be on the business growth national kind of level? And then the second question is just around the mechanism through which this money will be paid or money will be used. So are we talking national level? There was a mention of public finance institutions and development finance institutions. What is their role? How will they be engaged? And also how much of their own investment plans will have to be factored in? There's work being done around TBSA, around the African Development Bank. How do we align those principles of actual justice, which is what Tyler was also alluding to. And then I think just the ESCOM question needs to be unpacked a bit. So for example, you did mention that a lot of the money will be, trying to get ESCOM to transition, if not all of the money. How are we making sure once again that that's a just process and that we're not just going to see a very privatized, inaccessible green energy production? How are we, I think just the detail around ESCOM's involvement, and as we know, ESCOM very often leaks money. How do we make sure that that money is actually going to be, benefiting communities in a meaningful way? And how are they involved from now, not just in implementation, but also in the negotiation process?
I don't see any hands online, but we are running out of time. We have about 10 minutes before the session ends at 5.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
Oh, there's a hand at the back. Okay, sorry.
Forgive me, I'm new to this. Before I begin, I'd just like to second 3 questions that were asked, and that was the question around ESCOM from Courtney. I feel that that is an important thing that needs to be addressed in this meeting before we leave. The questions around and the call for transparency from both Zahir and Tabi saying, I feel that as young people in general, we need as much information as possible, seeing as this is our future. And also that from King Solomon around inclusivity. I mean, I feel that we should have more people from the most affected communities in these discussions. I know we are having multi-sectoral and multi-engagement with these communities, but I feel that having them here as well will still be incredibly valuable. So I have 4 main questions. The first around youth integration. So it's around the question of when we're implementing these strategies. I mean, obviously we're here, we're being consulted, but like in the actual implementation stages, where are youth going to be facilitated to be part of these, part and parcel of the implementation of these processes? I mean, I think as Zahir illustrated, mentioned to you all that, sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. As the things Zahir mentioned that we are a little bit scared about the implementation of this. I mean, where the money is going to go, but more so around the strategies. I mean, how these strategies are going to be carried out. I mean, you often find that we, as the South African government, have strategies that we initially plan, and then as we continue implementing, we get further and further away from where we actually said we're going to meet these targets. And I feel that maybe this would be something worth definitely considering. My second question is around accountability. Well, that's already been asked. My third question is around youth integration. I mean, a lot of discussion has been made around upskilling, reskilling workers in these most affected communities, especially when we're talking about South Africa, where we have a very large number of unskilled labor that is going to be displaced when we institute a just transition. I think I just wanted to know around discussions we've had with unions, trade unions, representatives of these of the labor organizations, and just find out from the PCC what have been the consultations, what have they said to you, just so we can also get an idea around that. And just a thought, just for going forward, just wanted to ask, maybe if we could have some representatives from government departments here as well, because I think a lot of the questions that we have can also be directed to them and they can also respond. I mean, we do have a bone to pick with them as well, not just you. And that's just a thought going forward. And oh, sorry, I nearly forgot this one. And lastly is around education. I feel that education is a component of just transition when we're talking about implementing this. I mean, I can speak to this as a student. In case you haven't seen, I look like a zebra crossing. I just came from school, that my blazer. Education is an important component of this, and we just wanted to know around how are we going to be planning to actually from a basic to higher education level, guiding young people towards the specific skills and specific industries that we think are going to be key and essential to just transition. I mean, I think that as a high schooler, many of the industries that a lot of my peers are going to be studying towards, when I research just transition, many of them might not still be around. And so it's a very scary thought that even now we have kids my age that are studying towards certain fields that we are discussing here, potentially just making redundant. And so that is my last question. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are like really great questions. I would like to ask people to give us a few more minutes beyond 5 p.m. As Daniel responds to the questions. And definitely agree with the that you should have more departments, particularly Department of Education. There's a lot of questions around upskilling and reskilling that I think he needs to hear and let us know how the department is going to address these issues as well. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. It's amazing how time flies. Yeah, let me just try and get through some of these questions in the kind of remaining time. I think the first thing which a number of you made reference to, I'd want to touch on is the YCAP and the process and the plan. I was actually, as we started the meeting, I was talking to Crispin about it and just indicating how impressed I was with that document in terms of its clarity, its concise, and also the sort of instrument that we used of those sort of blue shaded boxes with actual voices of people. I think it was a very, very strong document, and which actually, as much as we've said, look, we have to hear from you more than talk, not knowing how many of you would have been involved in that process, but certainly those of you that were part of that have greatly articulated what expectations are and where you think where it needs to be done, where answers are required. So I just want to commend those of you that were part of that process. That it's a very good document, and possibly also an avenue that you should hold decision makers accountable for, because it seems to be a useful avenue of youth-led interventions and how you become part of the process and decision making, that sort of nothing gets done, for you or about you without you. And so that's certainly because a number of you referred to that. So yes, starting with your questions. Yeah, I guess you're probably right in a sense that the way in which the transaction was announced at the time may have allowed for a very high level of expectation of how quickly those funds were going to flow. But as I said earlier on, there were a lot of high level principles and intentions that were contained that needed this amount of work to happen. I think I said in one of the PCC meetings that if you think about an agreement, or like a loan agreement of some sort. That was a very conditional statement of intent, backed by strong commitment, but there was no way a situation of saying, look, South Africa, here is this money on the table that you can have. What the countries committed to was to mobilize those funds over a period of 3 to 5 years, but certainly the headlines at the time made for possible sort of people construing that this is money that could be, that we were given and that's available. And right now, hence, also questions around it, do we have to repay it or not? And that maybe might not be clear at the time. The issues of transparency around offers, around security, anti-corruption measures, those are valid concerns and they need to be addressed. There will be, and that speaks to another question that was asked, in the plan, there will be an implementation section that will address how this plan will be implemented, which will include reporting, monitoring, evaluation, and various mechanisms that will hold us accountable in terms of the various components that are going to be deploying these funds. And as you can imagine, it is also very, very high on the agenda of donors and our partners to say, look, can we make sure that the governance around this is going to be such. Transparency around office and all of that, yes, also point well made. One of the issues, though, one would need to be also frank about is that, of course, what we are involved with here is a negotiating process. And so some of the elements of the negotiation may be affected by, well-meant intentions of putting things out there and the other side seeing you miles away and we're coming for. So there's kind of a balance around sort of making sure you don't negotiate in the media and in public and give away your positions through that, but that does not absolve us from a process that is we committed to, that as and when the situation unfolds and we get closer to the process that the transparency, including the points that was asked around how much of this money is going to ESCOM, what is going to what is going to clean hydrogen and electric vehicles. That's all work and that's been done, and that will all eventually be known. And yeah, the issue around holding and putting our partners under pressure, we don't forget to remind them that they've reneged on the international commitments that they've previously made, and that in a way also allows an element of leverage, because these are commitments that they need to deliver to, and some of these discussions are quite frank and quite robust when we engage with them. And so yeah, that is certainly our intention to hold their feet to the fire in terms of international commitments that they've made. Much of them will hold us to our commitment. And the other issue in terms of those questions, the key element and principle around this transition and the support and how quickly we transition has been with the caveat that we will transition at a pace that depends on the resources that are available. That is a very kind of important statement. That's like we're not going to be pushed into a timeline and a process that is not directed or informed by our own country-specific circumstances. Hence, the NSM business to be South Africa specific and South Africa own, and we're very much focused on that. And as you indicate, a number of questions are sort of outside our province, but deal with the general issues around policy environment in the country, and important that those discussions are held. But the YCAP thing I spoke to, and in terms of the points that you're making around sort of sustainable local manufacturing, and the plan has got elements that obviously translate what is in the political declaration as points that are in there. We talk to platinum and those kind of things. I guess the key issue, and that is all this discussion that we've been having over many years around beneficiation. We have, of course, what the economists call a comparative advantage in that we are in South Africa and that stuff is here, it's in the ground. What we need to convert that to is a competitive advantage, is what we do with the fact that we are in a position, unlike another country that hasn't got this resource, but how do we upskill? How do we get our productivity measures in place so that we can extract those to the benefit of how that needs to happen? Points of innovations, absolutely nothing that one can argue against there, and issues of national centers of excellence and things that we are talking about. Again, back to it at the risk of sounding like an excuse. What the JETP in terms of its time frame and how it's set up is meant to set the scene, to be a catalyst. Some of these issues that we're talking about, of course, things that you can achieve in 3 to 5 years. They're much longer processes that needs to be formed by the right policies, by the right investment and the right implementations in making sure that we eventually get there. But they need to be part of the mix, and that's indeed is articulated well in the white document, as I have said. There was a question about transparency and trust, which I think I touched on. Engagement to PCC and the task team, and I guess I said both are committed to continuing this engagement and making sure that there is this ongoing interaction in terms of making sure that everybody and all the voices are heard. Trying to suffer my own writing here. Oh, there was a question about the youth and making sure how we decide on this plan and we're involved. At the end of the day, the plan, as we indicated earlier, will be put to cabinet, and that's where the ultimate decision around the plan will be made by those that are elected representative. The question is that the process we're involved in getting to what we put on the table for them to decide and to consider. We need to make sure that there's enough participation there, all the voices are heard. But the ultimate decision in the sort of practical sense is what it's going to be at the cabinet level, and we must use the avenues that are available to make sure that we influence those decisions in the proper way. There was a repeated question about the breakdown of loans and funds, which we talked to, and then there was also a question around national, provincial, and municipal, how that's going to be integrated. Indeed, that is also part of what has been talked about and worked out in the plan to make sure that it's an integrated structure, because a lot of it needs to go where the most impact is, where the real implementation works. There was reference to work with the DFIs and the DBSA was mentioned. Indeed, we are also in discussion with them around how existing capacity and capability in the country can be used in disseminating these funds. And there was a question about labor unions as such. Yes, indeed, the consultation process with them has obviously been taking place as part of the Just Transition Framework and other processes. We get to a process of this initiative as well. And again, it's a question of just how practically you can include that. I mean, ideally, of course, every single one of the constituencies would be in the same room, but I don't know how that room would need to be. And that's why we're kind of parceling it out in the various constituencies. But the idea is obviously to bring all of that together in terms of what has heard, and that will then be reflected in the plan and demonstrated that all the relevant constituencies would have been consulted. Implementation was mentioned again. There is, as I said, a section in the plan that will speak to how this gets done through making sure that is continued engagement, continued consultation, because this is a long journey, as we said, and the JETP is just really the start of the journey. And so appropriate reporting mechanisms and how we evaluate, and as I said, course correct, we need to course correct it into account inputs that we get along the way. And I think in a roundabout way, I want to touch on the last question of education. It's very, very important that underpins the future ESCOM transition. That we have the right skills and the right levels of education for the type of new world and economy and green world that we're moving into. That must move in tandem for us to be able to be successful. I think we've touched all of them. We failed on one aspect, which was hearing from you a lot. There was a lot of questions, but that was important. We shouldn't worry about that. This is not the last interaction we've had. Some of the questions that I would have liked to ask you, which again, I will maybe just leave with you, and in either written submissions or when we next meet, we can talk to those. It was really a situation of the sense of urgency that you see as young people vis-a-vis us older people, and whether we are moving in tandem there, and if not, how actually we make sure that we are all on the same page around urgency of what we are addressing. And then obviously the question of how the transition to a low carbon economy and a more climate resilient society, how would we define success? We talked about it earlier, and how you as you, what would need to be in place, and some of it I think came through your questions, for this process to be perceived to be fair and equitable. And I guess the last one, which again we commented on in part, was around the white paper process, which I wanted to comment on, and asking, did that work? Does it work for you? Are you getting the responses? Is that the right avenue that we should be pursuing? How does that get strengthened in terms of making sure that the very, very relevant inputs and suggestions are put forward there are through the various processes? We certainly, as the task team, we look carefully at that as well.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Christine, as well. I think perhaps with the questions that you have, if it works, we can make them available. And it would be awesome if you could do a written submission, perhaps. And if we gave you maybe 2 weeks or so to maybe apply your minds and answer the questions, and maybe if I can invite you to consolidate for us, maybe working with your colleagues, that would be very helpful. So there's about 6 questions. Daniel's mentioned 3 of them. And they're very critical for obviously putting together a quality plan. There was one question I think which we might have missed, which was how is the justice part of the work being done? And maybe on the justice component of the investment plan, the extent to which that work is being done as a work stream. So I don't know if Daniel also wants to comment.
Look, I mean, just quickly comment on that. In fact, it so happens that tomorrow, as the task team, literally tomorrow, we are having a half-day session dedicated to just transition, and we have some resource persons that we've invited that have looked at the just transition component from various perspective in terms of work that they previously have done, to just say, look, how do we make sure that as part of this plan, this just element is woven into every bit of that plan, and that's one element of how we're dealing with that. And in terms of the secretariat, we have people in there that in terms of helping develop the plan, whose focus is on the justice component. So it's a very, very important aspect and is an essential feature of what that plan is to look like. So when it comes out, it'll have a very clear and targeted elements of how that's going to work. But it's work that is literally, as we speak, underway, and tomorrow the task team will spend dedicated time on thinking about the just component as well.
Before we close, Crispin, do you have any final words?
No, I mean, it's been an incredibly rich discussion. And I really want to just thank each and every one of you, our online audience, and for all of you that could be here physically in person today. You guys rock. I mean, you know, you're not just demanding a seat at the table. You're showing that, you've got these blazing, fierce principle ideas, and I think you add real value to the conversation. So yeah, I mean, from the side of the Climate Commission, we commit to continuing to supporting this process, making sure that you are there at the table where the decisions are made. And I've listened very intently. I mean, Daniel was in the hot seat today. I was very glad he was taking the pressure. But, you know, there are broader issues for the work of the Commission and for the implementation around the just transition that, I've heard you on. And I think we need to think more carefully about the implementation side. So, you know, you're saying we don't want to just be talked to about policy issues. We want to be part of the solution and part of the implementation. So that's something for us to go away and do a little bit of homework on as well and come back with clearer answers next time. As Daniel said, this is the start of a process. We'll have a follow-up engagement in September. I think you'll start to see the investment plan then emerging, and hopefully many of your ideas enshrined in that plan going forward. So thank you to Daniel for making time. I mean, I know he's under the whip, so he's got an incredibly pressurized diary. Thank you for our two chairs for expertly facilitating and steering us. And travel safely wherever any of you are going this evening.
Yes. Thank you, Crispin, for organizing this, and the team, Blessing and Tumisani. Thank you, Mr. Daniel and Chantel and your team also for allowing this, for having this session with us as young people. And thank you to the young people for proving that we are technical people, understand the jargon, and we also want to be part of the conversation as we're capable of being part of the discussion. So thank you for showing that today. And so, the discussion can't go back and say young people don't know what they're talking about. We need to dumb it down the terminology for them. I think today shows that that's not true. And definitely, Crispin knows that we hold to account. We will hold to account about the September consultation. And I think some of the requests from the youth is if we can have some draft document or something before that meeting, that will help also in the discussion for the next consultation. The next steps is that tomorrow we will send the questions that Daniel shared and wants feedback on. And please, we'll then try to consolidate with youth SAI and all of us, and then send it to Daniel's team by the 26th of August is the deadline to say when you will receive all the comments from young people. But thank you so much to everyone who joined us online and here in person. And I apologize if people online felt that we didn't include them as much, but thank you so much. And I see that the discussions were lovely online as well. But thank you so much, everyone. And as Kristen said, go home safely if you are traveling home. Thank you.
I think the PCC has also arranged some tea and refreshments outside, so thank you to them for that. So those that can stay, please do. Thank you.